Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And one of the first Dork Lord of the Rings segments I did was on Baldur the Hapless. He was a corpse in golden armor that Aragorn passed by in the paths of the dead. Well, today, we talk about another character with a similarly unfortunate title, Gorlim the Unhappy. Now, unless it's an ironic title, if history remembers you as Gorlim the Unhappy, you probably had a tough life. And spoiler alert, it's not an ironic title. Gorlim was a human from the House of Beor, who lived back in the First Age, so thousands of years before the events of the War of the Ring. We don't know exactly when he was born, but it was probably around the year 400 of the First Age. His father was named Angrim, and he had a wife named Eilunel, apparently the love of his life, and together they had a house and some land. Now, you might be asking, why do we care about Gorlim the Unhappy? Why is he important? He's important because for such a seemingly inconsequential character, his life directly impacts the destiny of Middle-earth in the First Age and beyond. So we're going to pick up his story in the year 455 of the First Age. And if that date sounds familiar, it should, because that's the year of the Battle of Sudden Flame, the Dagor Bragollach, when Morgoth broke the 400-year-long siege of Angband, decimating his enemies, including the House of Beor. During that battle, the head of the House of Beor, Brigalas, was slain, and leadership of the house passed to his younger brother, Barahir. Barahir, of course, is the father of the hero Beren, of Beren and Luthien fame. Barahir and his men, likely including Gorlim, rescue the elven king Finrod from certain death. And in gratitude, Finrod gives Barahir his ring, which becomes known as the Ring of Barahir and gets passed all the way to Aragorn in the Third Age. And he makes an oath to Barahir to repay this life debt. Just a little background. This passage describes the aftermath of the battle. It's from chapter 18 of the Silmarillion. Now Morgoth's power overshadowed the Northlands, but Barahir would not flee from Dorthonion, and remained contesting the land foot by foot with his enemies. Then Morgoth pursued his people to the death, until few remained, and all the forest of the northward slopes of that land was turned little by little into a region of such dread and dark enchantment that even the orcs would not enter it unless need drove them. And it was called Taur Nefuin, the forest under nightshade. The trees that grew there after the burning were black and grim, and their roots were tangled, groping in the dark like claws. And those who strayed among them became lost and blind, and were strangled or pursued to madness by phantoms of terror. At last, so desperate was the case of Barahir, that Emildir the Man-Hearted, his wife, whose mind was rather to fight beside her son and her husband than to flee, gathered together all the women and children that were left, and gave arms to those that would bear them. And she led them into the mountains that lay behind, and so by perilous paths, until they came at last with loss and misery to Brethil. But none ever saw again the men that they had left, for these were slain one by one, until at last only 12 men remained to Barahir. Beren, his son, and Beregund and Belegund, his nephews, the sons of Brigalas, and 9 faithful servants of his house, whose names were long remembered in the songs of the Noldor. Rathruin and Dairuin they were, Dagnir and Ragnar, Gildor and Gorlim the Unhappy, Arthad and Urthel, and Hathaldir the Young. Outlaws without hope they became, a desperate band that could not escape and would not yield. For their dwellings were destroyed, and their wives and children captured, slain, or fled. From Hithlum there came neither news nor help, and Barahir and his men were hunted like wild beasts. And they retreated to the barren highland above the forest, and wandered among the tarns and rocky moors of that region, furthest from the spies and spells of Morgoth. Their bed was the heather, and their roof the cloudy sky. So Morgoth has overrun the region of Dorthonion. It's now known as the Forest Under Nightshade. And Barahir's wife, Emildir the Man-Hearted, has led the remaining women and children safely out of Dorthonion, never to see their loved ones again. And at last, it comes down to Barahir and 12 men from the House of Beor remaining in Dorthonion. One of them is Gorlim the Unhappy. Morgoth is determined to have this little ragtag band found. Silmarillion, Chapter 19. Now the forest of Dorthonion rose southward into mountainous moors, and in the east of those highlands there lay a lake, Tarn Ailuin, with wild heaths about it, and all that land was pathless and untamed. For even in the days of the long peace, none had dwelt there. But the waters of the Tarn Ailuin were held in reverence, for they were clear and blue by day, and by night were a mirror for the stars. And it was said that Melian herself had hallowed that water in days of old. Thither Barahir and his outlaws withdrew, and there made their lair. And Morgoth could not discover it. But the rumor of the deeds of Barahir and his companions went far and wide, and Morgoth commanded Sauron to find them and destroy them. That's right, Sauron has been enlisted to track down and kill these outlaws by any means necessary. Unfortunately for Gorlim, he is going to provide those means. The next few quotes are all from Chapter 19. Now among the companions of Barahir was Gorlim, son of Angrim. His wife was named Eilenel, and their love was great, ere evil befell. But Gorlim, returning from the war upon the marches, found his house plundered and forsaken, and his wife gone. Whether slain or taken, he knew not. Then he fled to Barahir, and of his companions he was the most fierce and desperate. But doubt gnawed his heart, thinking that perhaps Eilenel was not dead. At times he would depart alone and secretly, and visit his house that still stood amid the fields and woods he had once possessed. And this became known to the servants of Morgoth. So Sauron now knows a weakness he can exploit. He knows that Gorlim pines for his wife, Eilenel, and occasionally returns to his house, hoping to find that Eilenel has come back and they could be reunited. Now, obviously, Sauron commits many evil deeds throughout Tolkien's mythology. But what he's about to do to Gorlim ranks pretty high on the evil meter, in my opinion, because it's so personal. It's a tailor-made torment for this very unlucky outlaw. On a time of autumn, he, Gorlim, came in the dusk of evening, and drawing near, he saw, as he thought, a light at the window. And coming warily, he looked within. There he saw Eilenel, and her face was worn with grief and hunger, and it seemed to him that he heard her voice lamenting that he had forsaken her. But even as he cried aloud, the light was blown out in the wind. Wolves howled, and on his shoulders he felt suddenly the heavy hands of Sauron's hunters. Thus Gorlim was ensnared, and taking him to their camp, they tormented him, seeking to learn the hidings of Barahir and all his ways. But nothing would Gorlim tell. Then they promised him that he should be released and restored to Eilenel if he would yield. And being at last worn with pain and yearning for his wife, he faltered. Then straightway they brought him into the dreadful presence of Sauron. Oh boy, this can't end well for Gorlim. He's now been captured and brought before Sauron himself. I told you this torment was personal. Sauron is about to have a one-on-one conversation with Mr. Unhappy. And Sauron said, I hear now that thou wouldst barter with me. What is thy price? And Gorlim answered that he should find Eilenel again, and with her be set free, for he thought that Eilenel also had been made captive. Then Sauron smiled, saying, That is a small price for so great a treachery. So shall it surely be, say on. Now Gorlim would have drawn back, but daunted by the eyes of Sauron, he told at last all that he would know. Then Sauron laughed, and he mocked Gorlim, and revealed to him that he had seen only a phantom devised by wizardry to entrap him, for Eilunel was dead. Nonetheless, I will grant thy prayer, said Sauron, and thou shalt go to Eilunel and be set free of my service. Then he put him cruelly to death. That last line, then he put him cruelly to death. Sauron has gotten what he wanted. Gorlim has betrayed Barahir and his brethren. Then Sauron makes a point of laughing in Gorlim's face, telling him it was all pointless because his wife's dead, then killing him in some cruel, torturous way. I mean, that's supervillain territory. It's also reminiscent of the Sauron we see in Lord of the Rings. He personally tortured Gollum for information on the whereabouts of the ring. Gollum remembered seeing the 4 fingers of Sauron's black hand. There's an implication that Sauron enjoys torturing people. We have to include Beren and Finrod in that group as well, later in the First Age. And now, Sauron quickly springs the trap on an unsuspecting Barahir. But Gorlim still has a part to play. In this way, the hiding of Barahir was revealed, and Morgoth drew his net about it. And the orcs, coming in the still hours before dawn, surprised the men of Dorthonion and slew them all, save one. For Beren, son of Barahir, had been sent by his father on a perilous errand to spy upon the ways of the enemy, and he was far afield when the lair was taken. But as he slept benighted in the forest, he dreamed that carrion birds sat thick as leaves upon bare trees beside a mere, and blood dripped from their beaks. Then Beren was aware in his dream of a form that came to him across the water, and it was a wraith of Gorlim, and it spoke to him, declaring his treachery and death, and bade him make haste to warn his father. Then Beren awoke and sped through the night and came back to the lair of the outlaws on the second morning. But as he drew near, the carrion birds rose from the ground and sat in the alder trees beside Tar Nailuin and croaked in mockery. There Beren buried his father's bones and raised a cairn of boulders above him and swore upon it an oath of vengeance. First, therefore, he pursued the orcs that had slain his father and his kinsmen, and he found their camp at night by Riddle's well above the fen of Serric. And because of his woodcraft, he came near to their fire unseen. There, their captain made boast of his deeds, and he held up the hand of Barahir that he had cut off as a token for Sauron that their mission was fulfilled. And the ring of Felagund was on that hand. Then Beren sprang from behind a rock and slew the captain, and taking the hand and the ring, he escaped, being defended by fate, for the orcs were dismayed and their arrows wild. So Barahir and 11 of the 12 outlaws are now dead. But thanks to Gorlim's wraith, Beren was able to avenge his father and retrieve the ring of Barahir. That ring becomes vital later when Beren visits Finrod to remind him of his oath. Finrod doesn't need the ring to know who Beren is, but his soldiers do. Without that ring, Beren never gets to Finrod. Thus, never takes a Silmaril from Morgoth. Thus, Eärendil never uses that Silmaril to successfully sail west, and thus, the host of the West never comes to defeat Morgoth at the end of the First Age. It's a domino effect, and Gorlim is one of those pieces. I'm not sure we know exactly what Gorlim's wraith represents. I think it's a state similar to the Oathbreakers of the Paths of the Dead. They broke an oath to Isildur, and their spirits became trapped in this world. Here, Gorlim betrayed his leader, Barahir. There's a sense of oath-breaking in his actions, and so his spirit is also trapped. Most of you are probably aware of Beren's story after he meets Luthien. It's a very popular aspect of Tolkien's mythology. But I thought I'd read you this passage showing how Beren goes from sole survivor to human in love with an elf. This is the immediate aftermath of Beren getting revenge for his father. Thereafter, for 4 years more, Beren wandered still upon Dorthonion, a solitary outlaw. But he became the friend of birds and beasts, and they aided him, and did not betray him. And from that time forth he ate no flesh, nor slew any living thing that was not in the service of Morgoth. He did not fear death, but only captivity. And being bold and desperate, he escaped both death and bonds. And the deeds of lonely daring that he achieved were noised abroad throughout Beleriand, and the tale of them came even into Doriath. At length, Morgoth set a price upon his head, no less than the price upon the head of Fingon, High King of the Noldor. But the orcs fled rather at the rumor of his approach than sought him out. Therefore, an army was sent against him under the command of Sauron. And Sauron brought werewolves, fell beasts inhabited by dreadful spirits that he had imprisoned in their bodies. All that land was now become filled with evil, and all clean things were departing from it. And Beren was pressed so hard that at last he was forced to flee from Dorthonion. Terrible was his southward journey. Sheer were the precipices of arid Gorgoroth, and beneath their feet were shadows that were laid before the rising of the moon. Beyond lay the wilderness of Dungortheb, where the sorcery of Sauron and the power of Melian came together, and horror and madness walked. There spiders of the fell race of Ungoliant abode, spinning their unseen webs in which all living things were snared. And monsters wandered there that were born in the long dark before the sun, hunting silently with many eyes. No food for elves or men was there in that haunted land, but death only. That journey is not accounted least among the great deeds of Beren, but he spoke of it to no one after, lest the horror return into his mind. And none know how he found a way, and so came by paths that no man nor elf else ever dared to tread, to the borders of Doriath. And he passed through the mazes that Melian wove about the kingdom of Thingol, even as she had foretold, for a great doom lay upon him. I really like that description of Dungortheb. It's the region where the sorcery of Sauron and the power of Melian came together, and horror and madness walked. I mean, there's an implication that those magics clashing has caused some kind of effect on the denizens of that land. And Beren, who faced a lot of legit horrors in his life, could never talk about the horrors he faced in Dungortheb. I mean, that's frightening to think about. Sauron is leading an entire army to hunt down one man. And notice how Sauron uses werewolves, fell beasts inhabited by dreadful spirits that he had imprisoned in their bodies. Is it possible that was his plan for Gorlim? That Sauron had intended to imprison the wraith of Gorlim into the body of a wolf? Could be an explanation for the wraith's existence. Though if so, it seems that Gorlim thwarted those efforts, at least temporarily, giving a warning to Beren. And so, Beren ends up entering Doriath and eventually catching sight of Luthien. And the rest is history. So now that we've seen the story of Gorlim's betrayal, what do we think of him? It's hard to see him as a villainous traitor, right? He's motivated by a love for his wife and a desperate need to be reunited with her. Compare that with the actions of another well-known traitor from the First Age, Meiglin. Gorlim betrays the men of the House of Beor. Meiglin betrays the elves of the hidden realm of Gondolin. As we'll see in this final quote, Meiglin, who finds himself in a very similar situation to Gorlim, is motivated by the lust for power and the desire for Idril, who is already married to Tuor with a child, Eärendil. This is from the Silmarillion, chapter 23. Now on a time when Eärendil was yet young, Meiglin was lost. For he, as has been told, loved mining and quarrying after metals above all other craft. And he was master and leader of the elves who worked in the mountains, distant from the city, seeking after metals for their smithying of things both of peace and war. But often Maeglin went with few of his folk beyond the leaguer of the hills, and the king knew not that his bidding was defied. And thus it came to pass, as fate willed, that Maeglin was taken prisoner by orcs and brought to Angband. Maeglin was no weakling or craven, but the torment wherewith he was threatened cowed his spirit, and he purchased his life and freedom by revealing to Morgoth the very place of Gondolin, and the ways whereby it might be found and assailed. Great indeed was the joy of Morgoth, and to Maeglin he promised the lordship of Gondolin as his vassal, and the possession of Idril when the city should be taken. And indeed, desire for Idril and hatred for Tuor led Maeglin the easier to his treachery, most infamous in all the histories of the elder days. While there are many similarities between Gorlim and Maeglin's betrayals, I do think it's fair to say that we're meant to feel more empathy for Gorlim, though he was probably way too naive about Sauron's treachery. Another big difference between the two of them is their actions immediately after their betrayals. Gorlim's spirit finds a way to warn Beren of his actions, whereas Maeglin fights on the side of Morgoth, trying to kill the young Eärendil. This might be a reach, but it occurred to me that another similarity between Gorlim and Maeglin is the number 12. Gorlim was one of 12 outlaws, and Maeglin was lord of the House of the Mole, one of the 12 houses of Gondolin. 12 outlaws, 12 houses. It reminds me of the 12 apostles. Perhaps Tolkien is casting Gorlim and Maeglin in the Judas role for their particular societies. In any case, those are my thoughts on the tragic life, death, and undeath of Gorlim the Unhappy. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye! In days of old, thither, Barahir and his outlaws withdrew.